Kia ora and welcome to Momentum. In this episode, we are chatting to Ted Kim from Vineyard USA at Evanston Vineyard near Chicago, Illinois. I would love to know, how do you address and tackle the topic of generosity?
It's about what it is that we exist for. How do we be faithful to what God has called us and to what God is doing in the world? You know, the good news is God's doing something in the world right now. He's awakening hearts. He is quietly setting people on fire. And we are noticing it here in America. I know that you are noticing it in Aotearoa. We were just talking about Beach Campus and all the wonderful things that are happening there. It's happening. God's doing something. And what does it look like for us to be faithful to that? What does it look like for us to play a small role in hosting the move of God to a certain degree? And so campaign is about vision. Generosity, though, is about discipleship. It's about becoming the kind of people who are like the woman with the alabaster jar. Mark 14, the woman with the alabaster jar who pours out that perfume, like that pure nard, and anoints Jesus for burial. So that alabaster jar of pure nard, that was her treasure. And we don't know really we don't know how that woman got that money. It's unlikely that she got it from employment. She probably got it because it was a family heirloom. So it's something that was in their home for a very, very long time. And it was essentially like her inheritance. But the interesting thing about that Mark 14 passage is the two little details in that Mark 14 passage. The first detail is that she didn't pour the perfume out. She broke the jar. She broke it. And what that means is you're not going to put anything back into a broken jar. She meant to spill her entire treasure out on the crucified and risen one, Jesus. That's the first thing. And then the second thing I think that's interesting about that passage, as well as the fact that this would be a story that we would continue to tell for generations and generations and generations, the story that would have influence beyond her lifetime. The other interesting thing about that story is that nobody understands why she's doing it. Not even the disciples. They're like, why are you wasting all this? It could have been used to feed the poor. And I think there's two lessons from that in terms of generosity. When it comes to following Jesus, we got to break the jar. We just have to break the jar. An untold blessing comes to us by breaking the jar. By breaking the jar, we begin to have the type of impact and influence maybe beyond our lifetimes. That's one thing discipleship oriented. And the other thing is that when you surrender all, people just don't understand. You know, we're doing like a crazy kind of thing. What? Giving to the church, giving to a campaign, giving sacrificially from your bank account when you don't really have all that much money to begin with. You're going to have a lot of people that are going to say to you, that just doesn't make sense. You could have used it for this. You could have used it for that. And so there's kind of like this mysterious thing about discipleship. Like we do things that don't quite make sense. They're paradoxical. Because, that's sort of like the gospel pattern. You got people that are coming to know Jesus, and as they come to know Jesus, there's a death that kind of has to happen, so that you can get life on the other side. Like you die to your old self and you die to your old way of life. And in that death, in that sort of crucifixion, you get life back, more life than you could have ever expected. And it's the same way with generosity. And so we're trying to teach our church that you break the jar and you do this paradoxical thing, but on the other end of that is your highest good. And that's really the lesson, I think, of discipleship, that when you are in charge of your own life, maybe that goes okay sometimes, but most of the time it doesn't. Maybe it goes okay for a little bit, and then you find yourself in the midst of the worst firestorm you could have imagined. Maybe you have kids. Who knows? Something happens. And the great lesson, I think, of discipleship is you cede control of your life to the one who knows everything, and the one you can trust, and the one who has your highest good in mind. And unfortunately, the way that it works, because we're human beings, is the things that are best for us are often things that we resist at first. And so we resist things that end up becoming great blessing for us later. And so that's kind of how we frame it. So Culture of Generosity is about discipleship. Campaign, it's about vision.
And with it being so countercultural, it can often be quite hard for people to get started. I'd love to know what are some of the guidelines or the steps that you could recommend for people to get started when it comes to being generous.
I think that you all do a really good job at Grace Vineyard talking to people about that. I mean, I think the only thing that I would say is give what you have faith for, but give a little more than you feel comfortable giving. Just give a little more than you feel comfortable giving. If it's going to be like $5 and that you feel comfortable with that, it's probably not enough. Because there has to be an element of trust in it. There has to be an element in the kind of like, I'm going to test God on this. And when you kind of like don't activate faith as you give, and you don't activate that kind of that challenge, I think you don't get the benefit of seeing the reward of the trust to a certain degree. And so I don't think you need to give 10% from your gross income right away necessarily, but I think you should give more than you feel comfortable giving. After all, I think that what the New Testament sets up is the example of Jesus as the one who gave all of himself to be sort of that radical kind of exemplar of generosity. So he didn't hold anything back.
With buildings and looking at buildings, and often when you step into a bigger building like we're going to be doing here with our city campus, at the moment, each Sunday is bursting at the seams with families and children and lots of people coming in. And so there's often needs for us to move into a bigger building. And oftentimes when we look at things like that, we hear that people start to worry around the idea of becoming a mega church, and the connotations that actually come with the title mega church. So could you tell us a little bit about, I guess, the connotations that may come with that, but also your views around big buildings and big churches as well?
Yeah, I mean, we got quite a big church ourselves, so we got a lot of people that come through. I thank God for big churches. There's a lot of big churches here in the States with really, really great, faithful pastors. And for whatever reason, large churches do just a wonderful job at two things in particular. The first thing is they become really, really great places for people to find faith for the first time. For whatever reason, people don't find faith for the first time at a lot of the smaller churches, but they seem to at bigger churches. I know that's not universally across the board, but in general, one of the big differences between a smaller church and a larger church is the number of salvations and baptisms that are happening. And of course, this is all about helping people come to know that God actually loves them and has mercy on them and grace for them. And for whatever reason, large churches do a really good job at introducing people to that. And the second thing that large churches do really, really well generally, to your point, Corey, is they do ministry to life stages really well. So if you got kids' church, a larger church will oftentimes have more age-appropriate kids' church stuff for your toddlers as opposed to your fourth graders. A larger church will oftentimes have a really good youth group for your high school age. I don't know quite what they call it in New Zealand, but here when you're like 14 to 18 or so, you go to what we call high school before you go to university. Well, it's the bigger churches that have ministries like that. Like our church, we have the only youth group really for high school students in the area. And so many people, many high schoolers, their faith becomes real for the first time when they are like 15 or 16 or 17. And, well, you have to have a large enough church to support like a youth group like that. Middle school is also like that too. So I'm all in favor of large churches. I'm all in favor of small churches too. And I don't think you can just paint with an unnuanced brush. All big churches are bad. And I think that if you were to ask the leadership of Grace Vineyard, nobody would say we set out to make a name for ourselves. We set out to build this church that would like dwarf all the other institutions in our country. I think you just had faithful people that were trying to respond to what God is doing. And so if it became large, it becomes large. I mean, like I sit in a lot of uncomfortable conversations about being larger and talking about like, well, what does it mean for us to be larger than our largeness now? Those feel like uncomfortable conversations, but at the same time, they feel like for me, my sense of faithfulness toward what God has called me to is to say yes to things that are a little bit larger, even though I probably would prefer to be at a place that was a bit smaller. All sizes of churches are pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just as we draw to a close, I would love to know if you have any stories of radical generosity or any stories that could inspire us. I know oftentimes I'm really encouraged and inspired when I hear stories of people who have stepped out and done something countercultural or stepped out in what God's called them to. So would you happen to have any stories that could encourage us as a church?
Well, I would just say, especially given the audience of this particular podcast, what I have seen that has been really encouraging to me in the life of our church is the numbers of young people that have said, okay, well, I'm going to trust not my own head or my own rationality, and I'm going to rather trust the mystery of God's word to actually tell me a better story about my life, and I'm just going to begin giving. And I've watched that happen, and I've watched kind of like God give back to them, like that couple that I was just talking about, who didn't tithe before, were sort of like worried about where they were going to live, and then ended up like with a job offer, and ended up with like a bank account. They just didn't realize how much money they would have in it. And all of a sudden they were praying about a move, and then they already found a house. It was like God was blessing every single one of them. And then to another couple who gave a testimony recently, they have a couple young kids. They were a disaster financially. And then they came to the church and they got things in order, such to the fact they began giving radically and generously to the church. And I know that because I see all the giving records. And they were able to pay off their house in 2 years, this house that they have in this expensive city, because of just like kind of what God has taught them about generosity, sort of the correlative things that happen with their finances and whatnot. And in the space that they're in, they were actually able to give. And then all these other things too, like if you're in the one last thing that I would say is that like if you find yourself in the predicament where you're constantly worried about money and the car breaks down, and then, this is my story. My car would break down. Like I had all this debt. Weird things would happen to me. Like all of a sudden I get this weird bank charge, or I would get, we'd deposit the money that my parents would send me because they knew I was a poor student. And then all of a sudden I'd lose some of that money, or all of a sudden I would throw that money away. For whatever reason, I was just like really uncareful. Like a lot of accidental things happened to my money. And then I just decided, well, I'm not very good at being in charge of my money. So I'm just going to let God be in charge of my money, like to that point what I was going to say. And I'm just like, I'm going to just start giving. And I didn't start giving everything right away. But then once I started giving 10% of my gross income, things just dramatically turned. All of a sudden, all these little funny things that happened to drain my money just stopped happening, you know? And I could tell you all these other stories too of people who started to give, getting like checks for the exact amount of the rent that they owed the next day. People getting like someone saying like slipping like money into your pocket because they felt like the Lord told them to give you money when you were like really, really pinched. Because that's the way that it kind of works, right? Like in Exodus, there was manna in the desert, and the manna was like this lesson for the whole people of Israel. It was kind of like, you know, someone gathered much and someone gathered little. Those who gathered much gave to those who gathered little. And when you say yes to giving, all of a sudden you put yourself in the economy of the kingdom. And then all of a sudden God speaks to people to give money to you and to help you out or to send you a check. Just countless stories. I have countless stories. I know countless stories of people who needed to be rescued, but they were faithful in their giving, and all of a sudden a check showed up in their mailboxes the next day, or someone like slipped you a little bit of money in your like little card, you know, someday, and said, I just felt like the Lord was supposed to give it to you. And of course, God's going to do that to you too, you know. I think the most moving times I have had is when we have given radically, and out of faith to folks, out of the little money that we have. I felt far greater blessing than that. I just remember helping to pay for one of my friend's education and just crying when I was giving him the money.
Amen. Thank you so much, Ted. God
You're
bless
welcome.
you. Thank you so much.